Thank you for being here. And if I've done my job well in the next 55 minutes, my goals are basically to review the following three learning goals and then to jump right in. So I am here to help provide the economic rationale behind why organizations like CCL and many other economists and notable individuals support carbon fee and dividend style policies and what they really are. I'm here to specifically address your questions on these issues. So please start using that Q&A button like Georgianne mentioned, and we'll make sure to get to that. My presentation is basically going to focus on three different areas here, and then at the end of each of those three, the fee, the dividend, and the adjustment, we'll save time 4 or 5 minutes for questions to really highlight anything that people might be curious about. But going back to this learning goals area, I'd also love to just make sure to highlight ways that you can get more engaged and deepen your own research of all of the areas that you can find out more about beyond this quick summary. All of the different speaker notes that I've put in the slides are available, and you can do your own lit review afterwards. And I'd also love to just find some ways to take action if you're interested at the end. So let's jump in for our hour together here with a little bit of background. And we'll start just by highlighting the organization that I represent now is Citizens Climate Lobby. It's a wonderful nationwide nonprofit that's nonpartisan and it's grassroots driven that is focused on climate advocacy. We have over 500 chapters throughout the country that you can see here on the map, and they're organized around congressional districts. And we're working to build relationships to move our members of Congress forward on climate change, no matter who they are or where they're at on this issue. So we're generating that political will for a livable world, and this is a wonderful opportunity to engage in your community if you're interested. I won't spend much time on this today, but if you are interested, we can put a link in the chat where you can find out and join with your local chapter. It's just a very direct, simple URL that people even listening in without seeing the chat can see. Simply cclusa.org/intro. That'll get you connected to your local group. And we focus with these 5 main levers: lobbying Congress, working with media, building support from the grassroots base of the community and the grass tops, and then also developing our groups so they're bigger, stronger, and more successful. But that's not why I'm here today. What I'm here today to do is talk about your questions on carbon pricing and really be able to highlight the kind of history of the last congressional session, specifically with one of the flagship policies. But what I wanted to do with this slide is highlight in the last congressional session, and again, we're talking about the 116th Congress, not the one that we're currently in that just started in January, but there was a plethora of bills in Congress that put a price on carbon. All of them were proposed, none of them made it through and actually passed. So we're not talking about actual legislation here, but these are proposed pieces of legislation that did different decisions in how to actually deal with the fact that right now we're treating our atmosphere like an open sewer, and that people aren't actually accounting for the pollution that they're imposing on our society when they do that pollution for greenhouse gas emissions. So the one I'm going to talk specifically about as a gateway in is the one that Representative Deutsch has introduced and that CCL is advocating for, called the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. But you can specifically see all of the rest of these as well for more information. And in the chat, again, we'll put a link where you can find those slides. So just as a window in, with this one particular policy, the Energy Innovation Act, this bill in the last session gained 86 co-sponsors, both a Republican, Francis Rooney out of Florida, as well as many Democrats from throughout the country. And we wanted to highlight, again, that before we jump into the actual nitty-gritty of the economic details, that this bill has broad support from across the country, many different states, many different interest groups, and that it's a really popular policy that we expect and plan to have Representative Deutsch introduce very shortly in this session. We don't know the anticipated timeline as far as whether it's tomorrow or in the next several months, but we do know that he shared with us that this remains one of his top priorities, and he's working with his colleagues on both sides of the aisle to really get the band back together again and have as many co-sponsors join in the reintroduction with him and bring in more people on both sides of the aisle with that. So with all of that review, let's jump into the challenge that we face, and then we'll go through each of our different legs that we like to think of as the three key flagship elements, or the three legs of the stool of carbon fee and dividend policies. And this is the challenge that we face. There are billions of individuals, millions of firms, thousands of governments, hundreds of nations, and all of them, if we're going to be successful in tackling climate change, are going to have incentives to move towards the lower carbon options. And this challenge is global, as the Nobel-winning economist William Nordhaus identifies in this quote. So the challenge is that we need to raise the price of goods and services that are carbon intensive to provide that incentive. And what we're going to talk about today is one approach in doing that, called carbon fee and dividend. And the general principle, before jumping into each of the elements, is very straightforward. What you do is you put a steadily rising fee on those goods as upstream as possible in our economy so that it has minimal impact. All of these goods are already having an excise tax or some other way that they're having to account for their weight before they enter our economy. So that would be an additional line item, and we'll get to that in a little bit. And then you collect that money and efficiently return it back to households. 100% of that net revenue goes back to you, I, Bill Gates. We all get an equal share, and children up to 18 get half shares. And then the equally critical element that we'll be discussing is also the fact that if we're going to do this domestically, we want to make sure to protect our own manufacturing and jobs so that we're not offshoring all of that activity to other countries that don't have as ambitious of policies, and create the incentive to make sure that those countries actually do put in place an equivalent price for their own trade relationships with us. So that's really the three legs of the stool, and let's spend the next 45 minutes talking about each of those. The only thing that I'll also just close with, because it comes up a lot in questions, and I just wanted to highlight this right at the very beginning, is the whole goal isn't to create a fancy policy. The whole goal is to reduce emissions and get on track with the best available science to decarbonizing our whole economy. And this one policy gets us on track and pegs us to basically an emission reductions pathway to 90% of the required 100% emissions by mid-century. So many other policies are important and also need to be enacted. I think it's really important out of the gate to highlight that this is not going to solve the problem entirely. This is not a silver bullet. We are in the era of silver buckshot, where there's going to be many solutions needed at the table. And the Biden administration has already highlighted a lot of this, the different approaches. We in CCL and other economists and organizations feel that this should be a central part of finally accounting for those costs. But by no means is this going to get us there alone. So with that, why the fee? Let's jump into each of these legs of the stool. So the first one, why the fee? Well, the basic principle, right, is to raise the price of fossil fuels, and the demand then goes down. This is, a simple premise. This connection is not understood, though, or accepted outside of the economic community often, but we know this, right? When the price of something goes up, the demand goes down. So with that, then, our climate problem is due to a major market failure resulting in negative external costs on each of us. And without a fee, what we're doing is we're subsidizing the fossil fuel industry to a massive degree. When a factory dumps its pollution, such as carbon dioxide, into the air or the water, that cost falls on all of us, not on them. They're passing it on. And so there's no incentive for them as the producer or the polluter to change that behavior. And that's really where this idea of the polluter pays principle applies. CCL's carbon fee puts that cost back on the cause of the pollution, fossil fuels. And if some of you have heard of the idea of a Pigouvian tax, this is the 100th anniversary of that concept, and we're finally trying to enact that idea. So the fee starts low at $15 per ton of carbon dioxide emitted, and it rises $10 annually, or if those ambitious emission targets aren't being met, there's a flexibility to actually boost that to a $15 a ton increase every year. Now, most other proposals that we talked about briefly at the beginning in Congress start higher or start a little lower and then escalate at their own different rate. This is the pathway that this particular bill, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend, acts, and it gets us on track to achieve 90% emission reductions by mid-century. This fee, I think it's also key to highlight, will generate approximately $3 trillion in revenue over the next decade. So it's a significant chunk of change we're talking about. So why a raising fee? Well, the key principle here is that any carbon pricing policy isn't going to do. The great power of this approach with the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act is that it sends a predictably rising price. And that means that there's a powerful economy-wide signal for investment and innovation, unlike other approaches that may come from a cap and trade design or even regulatory approaches, which don't provide that trajectory, that predictability, that environmental certainty that highlights that in 10 years, here's where you can peg your price, here's where you can make a long-term business decision based on this forecast. And the other key thing to highlight here with the fee is that it avoids, by starting low and escalating over time, economic shock or any early political backlash. You know, British Columbia and Canada have followed the same idea. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. They started low and they build that rising price, and that's avoided backlash. It also allows planning and economic adjustment by industry, utilities, households. Each of us can see this price signal moving forward and make plans accordingly, and also provides that clear long-term signal that the largest household behavior is going to be helped guided by. So basically this idea that you, the smart money, is on low carbon investments for you and your household. And you, by making those investments, are going to save money in the long term. There's a whole bunch of other reasons that we won't jump into as far as why the fee is so effective, from simplicity to the importance of transparency in our government, to economic efficiency and effectiveness, as well as the administrative ease. I'm happy to talk about any of these in our Q&A, but I just wanted to highlight those and then move forward in highlighting and just honoring actually the former advisory board member for CCL, one of only 2 individuals in the history of the US that's actually held 4 different cabinet level posts. Secretary George Shultz actually just passed away about a week ago, and we have owed a lot of our success in building support on both sides of the aisle to Secretary Shultz. And I wanted to acknowledge just his role in building dialogue, especially within the Republican Party, for support for policies like this, as well as an effective framing that he really has made a strong case for. And that is simply, it's not a tax if the government doesn't keep the money. The term fee is therefore appropriate. It's commonly used for other environmental programs that assign cost to pollution activities. You know, you dump your garbage in the street, a fee for pickup is often imposed, right? It's the same thing here, and we really want to honor and remember Secretary Shultz for his contributions on this, as well as all the other fronts that he was active with. Another key area, and I just wanted to give a little preview. I've got about 4 more slides, and then we'll go to Q&A here. So keep putting those questions in the Q&A, and then Lori and Georgianne will get us that question in just a bit. Is the administrative simplicity, right? So the carbon fee and dividend can use existing IRS and Treasury Department procedures and avoid creating a new bureaucracy, as well as minimize the risk of abuse and corruption. And it can piggyback again with those current fees for fossil fuels. And what we mean by that is that the fee is applied as upstream as possible, as close as to where it enters our economy, at the mine, at the well, at the port of importation. For coal, that means that the fee could be imposed at the mine or approximately 500 prep plants. For oil and gas, especially for our Texas network, which might be curious about how that's applied, that can be placed directly at the approximate 140 refineries or the 500 natural gas processing plants. The bottom line is that it's manageable. And it's also important to highlight that fluorinated gases will also be subject to the fee as well. So we can jump into the nitty-gritty on that in Q&A if people are curious. The key thing, too, again, to keep highlighting is that the impact on emissions is what we care about most, and that is significant. Different modeling forecasts show reductions between 25 to 50% basically by 2030, far exceeding our Paris commitments and the former Clean Power Plan targets. In terms of growth, the U.S. service industries that are most likely to benefit include retail, healthcare, construction. Modeling doesn't come close to capturing all those benefits. And the key area that they often miss is that they don't capture health benefits, and especially local pollution reduction, which is absolutely key in preserving or fighting for, as Georgianne mentioned at the beginning of our hour together, with the equity impacts of any proposal. And so the key thing that oftentimes economic forecasting leave out of any of these climate policies is how that actually cleans up the air and benefits on the health side of things with communities, which this policy is going to do hugely. And we can get into that detail in just a bit. People often always ask about, so what does that look like then in my own pocketbook? If you put a $15 per metric ton of, carbon dioxide fee, what does that translate to as far as how I feel the squeeze? Well, the bottom line here, you can highlight, both the anticipated cost for gasoline or electricity. Household energy costs will rise about 5 to 10% a year with that initial fee. And this is going to help stimulate awareness and initiation of change behavior without economic shock. So, one key thing here is that the U.S. home, on average, pays about $2,000, just a little bit over annually, on heating, cooling, water heating, appliances, and a 10% increase on that is about $200 a year. So keeping in mind, the first year for a dividend was actually going to be about $750 for a family of 4. Let me ask you in the chat what you think you are influenced by with the price of something and what you might actually use that initial $750 for in your own energy improvements. So feel free to share those in the chat, and then we'll get to those in Q&A as well. And what I'd like to do is just quickly highlight before we go to Q&A, is this happening other places? People often ask that, and if so, has it been effective? And a great example of the impact of a carbon fee can be seen from the United Kingdom. They imposed a carbon tax or a floor on their coal and gas for power generation, which directly caused, or directly after that, again, whether it was causative or correlative, we can debate, but there was an 85% decline in coal use in the same time period from 2014 to 2017. And the UK imposed that on top of their own European Union cap and trade program. And now we saw that United Kingdom organizations that were initially imposed now advocate for continuing to do that. So direct impact, in other international examples. And the other thing I'll just highlight on the international front is that a lot of these different carbon pricing programs are actually quite low. They're stuck at a low price pegged that isn't as high or as ambitious nearly as what this policy proposes. And this is largely because early policies didn't protect households and industries, the two major constituencies that this policy tries to address. And so critics might highlight, these low prices, they don't have an impact, so the, fee and dividend won't work. And what I would make the case of is highlighting that they're comparing a first generation policy with our fourth generation policy here, with wide coverage of all fossil fuels, a rising fee, and protecting the bottom 2/3 of households with that dividend. So with that, what I'd love to do is just open it up to the phones. Lori and Georgianne, if you wanted to, I can go back to any of those if you want, but let's just pause for Q&A about the fee.
Sure, I have one question that was sent to me privately. It says, wouldn't the fees end up back in the lap of customers? The winter storm has shown us the weakness of energy derived from wind turbines. And what she's referring to is wind turbines have frozen up, and so they're not operating right now. It has added to the outages seen across Texas.
Yeah, absolutely. So great questions, and I'm by no means an expert in ERCOT, so I won't go fully into the wind outages. I will highlight that renewables are often questioned for reliability, but especially for the storms that we're seeing right now, I think it's important to also recognize that fossil fuels aren't perfectly consistent either, and that the blackouts, as far as I understand, in Texas currently are actually mostly from the cold interfering with gas and coal electricity production. So obviously all power sources are being impacted right now, but I've got a helpful link I can put in the chat to SP Global on that front too. And you're totally right. That question gets at this key dynamic. Households will see rising energy costs. That is actually by design. The point, though, is that they'll also see an equivalent, if not greater, dividend, giving that money back to them and allowing them freedom of choice how they choose to spend it. So we'll get into the dividend on the second area, but what I tried to highlight here with this earlier slide was just highlighting that yes, local costs will increase. That's not something we're trying to cover up. In fact, we want to make the market tell the truth and reveal the hidden costs right now that no one's currently taking responsibility for, and that we're essentially socializing by putting that on the healthcare system or on our military for protecting our supply lines. Right now, the polluters are not paying, and we as a society are bearing that cost. So great questions. Anything else that would be helpful to highlight?
Dr. Cease, we have a comment from Kim who says you were asking what somebody would spend that dividend on, and she said that she would probably use it to purchase a generator.
Oh, I love hearing that. Thank you. Exactly that. Please keep going with those. And I think it's obviously a sad day right now that the generator is such where we're clearly struggling with this disruption of the polar vortex and clearly highlighting again global weirding going on in front of our very eyes, where the Minnesota weather that we are used to and have infrastructure to withstand and build out is impacting and hurting, and if not, putting people in danger throughout the whole South. Where weather is warmer right now in Greenland than it is in Texas. That's definitely the kind of forecast that people were predicting, and here it is now at our doorstep. And I put a link in the chat to an SP Global article that talks more about the electrical outages in Texas, especially with ERCOT. Any other questions in the chat?
Brett, if you could speak just for a moment also about the difference between weather and climate, because I've seen some comments on my Facebook feed about people saying, well, we're not having global warming. Look, we're cold right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly, one of the best pieces of example is, I'll just kind of put a link to it in the chat. There is a great polar vortex kind of explainer. There's a lot of groups that are doing that right now, but basically USA Today, that source that we all get in our newspapers, really highlights again how the polar vortex brings record low temperatures and winter storms. And again, the idea of this article is highlighting that normally the vortex is a large area of cold air held high up in the atmosphere around the North Pole. And what's happening is that when we have a rapidly warming atmosphere, that polar air can slide down towards the US and funnel that Arctic bitterly cold air over the central and eastern part of our country. And then basically that high pressure system from our jet stream actually can push it further south, and then it gets stuck in there. And so this is actually a direct connection to the ongoing setup that we've kind of been predicting with the polar vortex air. And I definitely, if people are curious, I didn't come prepared to talk much more about that, but would recommend a helpful explainer that I just put in the chat from USA Today. All right, so let's jump in. If that's all right, I'll go to the dividend, because I think that is actually equally critical in just really understanding why this is such an important, critical policy for kind of all three of the legs standing together. So if it's okay with you, I'll jump into the dividend, and then let's save another 5 minutes after that for Q&A, and then another 5 minutes at the end after we talk about the border adjustment. Is that all right with you?
Yes, perfect.
All right, off we go. All right, so we've already talked about this first step, right? So basically where different fuel sources pay a carbon fee that goes to this larger trust fund that goes back to households. But let's actually talk about now what it actually does to work out for all of us, you and I as American households, and how the dividend actually helps each of us participate in putting solutions to work. So I think the first area to explore is just what kind of amount are we talking about? And the dividend consists of a full share for up to 2 adults, half shares for children up to ages 18. A family of 4 then in that first year is anticipated to get about, well, I guess this is for the year 3, $3,000 a year. You can see here that first year on the first year 3 on the right hand column is $2,000. Year 5 is $3,100. And then by year 10, that amount annually for a family of 4. And the revenues are very large. Again, they're going to be reaching about $2.5 to $3 trillion over the first 10 years. And there's a great resource for people that are curious about more. I can put in the chat about the dividend delivery study that's also in our speaker notes. And again, if people want to, in the chat, share what you would do to start investing if you started receiving about $75 in a monthly dividend, to also kind of look out for your household footprint as well. So then why the dividend? Everyone's got a view on how to use that amount of money, right? And politicians, chances are, probably want to spend it in their own special cash cow programs rather than rebating it back to people. But the key thing to understand here is why a household dividend is because of 2 huge reasons. The dividend is A, most equitable. So we're looking out for that equity bottom line that Georgianne highlighted. And at B is also bringing long-term political viability. People won't want that money taken away from them if they see that as, again, the benefit that it helps them provide. So they're going to like it and advocate for the continuing of the fee and allow that fee to continue to rise to finally address all those externalities we talked about. It also pumps money, all that dividend going back to us as households, into our economy at the local level. And the consumer level benefits small and medium businesses. And that is the backbone of our economy, not these large corporations, but small and medium businesses, which have been hurt especially heavy right now with COVID. And so I think that key is essential to highlight with why the economist statement and support has been so, gung-ho about supporting a policy like this, and why 3,500 economists have signed on. If people are curious, I can put a link to that in the chat as well, and I'll also put a link where people can find more about the household dividend study. But here's a link to that economist statement, and here is a link to the dividend delivery study. So with that, though, let's keep on going along. And the other reason why I wanted to tease out the equitability issue is that if you look at this, here's a study, I'll read through the whole 100+ pages that the Treasury Department actually conducted. And what they found is that the bottom 2/3 of households, if you do this approach, especially compared to other uses of that revenue that are highlighted here, the bottom 2/3 generally break even or even come out ahead, which means that their dividend equals or exceeds any increased cost of energy products. So it disproportionately benefits lower income households. And I think that's a really key area to highlight, especially compared to some of these other areas like corporate tax reduction or payroll tax reduction. And people often will ask then, well, what does that look like for us in our state or in our district or in our area? And what I'd love to do is highlight, I'm glad that you asked, for Texas, what these predictions are and where you can find out more information from a study that's also available called the Household Impact Study. And so let me put a link to that in the chat if you're curious while we talk. Here is where you can go. And basically what the finding is here is that over half, 57% of Texas households come out actually ahead, and another quarter come out with only a minor loss, which means that they're only seeing an impact that would be less than 0.2% of their income. Again, so only, $100, $200 at most. And especially if you start looking, again, that's the overall average for Texas. That's at this point estimated to be at 83%, either benefit or come out with just a small minor loss. But if you look at the bottom quintile, so the lowest income earners in our country, 96% actually come out ahead. And that's what this quintile by quintile breakdown looks like. You know, what is the lower income earners breakdown compared all the way to the middle income compared to the higher income? And the key thing to highlight, I would say, even with the high income earners, is that more than half experience a gain, or roughly a gain, or a insignificant loss compared to the income, and that there's plenty of ways for an individual to learn and have a loss that actually leads to a gain through clean energy opportunities that are going to emerge and be innovated in our economy. The other key area, especially talking about equity impacts, that I think is key to highlight for Texas households, is that families of color experience on average more financial gains under this plan as a result of lower household spending associated with their current lower actual carbon footprint. So larger households, which mean that lower emissions per capita benefit and come out ahead with this policy, and other community factors also lead to this important thing to highlight in terms of which households in which areas actually come out ahead or are experiencing a minor loss. And the other key thing to highlight too is that these results are achieved without the needs for complex or costly targeting or means testing, and that these benefits are in addition to health benefits of air pollution that's going to be reduced on the local level due to the policy as well. The other area that people might be curious about for Texas is the impact on a rural versus an urban household. And the same study highlights that the impact on households actually is very little in difference across rural, suburban, and urban households. And this is because largely most of the cost increases that we see from the fee impact the goods that we purchase much more than the actual direct transportation cost increases that we'd see or in heating costs. And I have a slide that we can go into that more if people are curious during Q&A that breaks down those costs. But I think the other key thing to highlight with the dividend, and I've got 2 more slides and then we'll go to Q&A again here, is that what are the other ways that we could use that revenue, and are they equally equitable? And if you look at a history of all of the other ways, or at least some of them, that clean energy programs have historically tried to use revenue to incentivize further development, a lot of them have been regressive. And in particular, clean energy programs that target tax rebates, you know, for example, here's an example that highlights like a tax credit that you get for buying an electric vehicle. Most of that money goes to the high income earners. So what this chart is saying is that here is each of the different quintiles, and here's the amount of money going to each of those earners. And right now, only 10% of that money, at least by one of these studies done by the Energy at Haas, highlighted that only 10% of those clean energy rebates went actually to the bottom 60% of households. So very unevenly distributed impact that is not equitable. People also are curious about Canada. Canada has been in the news a lot, and in large part with their carbon fee and dividend system. This is because of the success that it's had. They put a national carbon price in place. It started at $20 Canadian in 2009. In their major election then, later that year, the parties that supported it prevailed in the election, proving that it was a durable policy, and that now, in the last basic 3 months, Canada now is pledged to raise that fee and increase the frequency by which households are getting that money back to a quarterly payment, and that actual fee is scaling up in the next 10 years to reach $170 Canadian per ton of CO2, which is right on track with that same level of ambition that CCL is supporting with the Energy Innovation Act. So all that being said, what I'd love to just highlight again is that some media reports you might hear say carbon pricing is yesterday's news. They seem to have overlooked the recent endorsement of carbon pricing by the Business Roundtable, by the Commodities Future Trading Commission, with Financial Risk Report calling for carbon pricing, the Chamber of Commerce changing their position to include support for market-based mechanisms for climate policies, and even the recent bill that we highlighted at the very beginning by the second-ranking Democrat in the Senate, Senator Durbin. So I think it's just key to highlight that fee and dividend is alive and well with many glowing endorsements. With that, let's go to questions for the dividend side of things.
We had one comment from earlier that the wind outages have happened because the turbines were not winterized properly. There are tons of wind projects that this person has been involved with throughout the northern US and Canada, and if they're winterized properly, there's no problem with them.
Thank you for that comment. Yeah, I know that article that I put in the chat from SP Global highlighted that total wind output is slightly below expectations, but again, the main supply issue is lack of available thermal generation right now, both gas and coal due to freezing conditions. What other questions do people have, especially about the dividend or anything that I've reviewed a bit too quickly here, trying to fit it all in?
I don't have any more. Do you, Lori?
I did have one. The last comment, this attendee said that they would buy a generator. Another person pointed out, does your presentation support reinvestment into non-renewable sources like a gas-fueled generator? Which was my concern.
Yeah, so that is the thing. There is no policing. Every individual is allowed, and in the spirit of freedom of choice, to use that money and their dividend however they want. There's no restriction on, you can only spend it this way or verify it with this kind of proof. The whole assumption of people being able to kind of invest that as they choose to see fit is built into the modeling that still says this will lead to the emission reductions that were projected. 90% decarbonization by mid-century, 40% in the next decade. So yeah, there is no kind of restrictions on how people spend it. The economic incentives are there that most households will most likely participate in using that dividend or their investments in low carbon directions, but there is no mandate that says that that's how it has to be spent. So I think that's another one of those principles that actually, again, can find value across the aisle on this. That conservative value of freedom of choice is very present with the policy design.
And Brad, if I would, if you'll let me just
please
tag on to what you're saying. That is why Dallas College thinks it's so important for us to do this Sustainable You outreach education about sustainability, because we want to make sure that people have all the facts that they need in order to make good decisions. So we appreciate that all of y'all have joined us today, and our goal is to make you sustainability leaders in your community so that you can go out and help people understand that their choices do make a difference.
Well put. Should I keep going, or is there any other questions?
Yes, keep going.
All right, excellent. So let's jump in. I'll save another 5 minutes here at the end of the adjustment. But let's talk about, why a border adjustment. And this is definitely the wonkiest area to discuss. So I'm going to try to keep it simple with just a few slides and then really explain each of them as in depth as I can. And this, in my opinion, is a must-have feature for a policy to succeed on a global basis. Again, highlighting that initial quote that William Nordhaus shared about this not just being a problem the US is facing. This is a global issue. And Europeans are already starting to consider this and roll this out for the next couple of years. So the US better make sure to get in line or get planning, get smart quick. So what is a border carbon adjustment? Well, essentially that adjustment is two things. There's a tariff, basically a tax, that's placed on goods imported from, and then a rebate on goods exported to countries without an equivalent price on carbon. And the tariff and the rebate are based on the carbon content of the goods imported or exported. And the terms duties, tariffs, levies, you often may hear these, especially with the accelerated trade wars that we've been having as a country with China in the last couple of years. You may hear those terms in the news cycle and use them interchangeably. But let's just take a specific example to help break this down. So Brazil, assume that the US has a carbon fee and Brazil doesn't. The adjustment then has two parts: a tariff on goods imported from Brazil, where there's no equivalent price in their own country on carbon, and a rebate then on US exports to Brazil. A Brazilian firm doesn't pay a carbon fee in their country, and it has an unfair advantage over its US competitor. They can export to the US and undercut that firm in our country that has a higher cost due to the fee, right? That's a real implication of this policy. So the reason why the adjustment is critical is that we impose as a country a tariff on that Brazilian import to level the playing field. And when a US company tries to export to Brazil right now, again, with higher costs, it won't be competitive. So the rebate end of this is paid to the US company on the carbon content of their product. And that basically is in place so that if Brazil establishes its own comparable fee, then there aren't any countervailing duties or rebates either way. It incentivizes other countries to adopt a similar level of ambition so that they can recoup that money back in their own country. And it also minimizes leakage. Again, kind of a good faith effort in one country happening, and then all of those intensive industries just leaking out and going to another country and still having the same emissions going on, just like squishing a balloon and having the air go somewhere else. This is trying to address that and lock everyone in place with the same set of rules that are transparent and easy to comply with. So why a border carbon adjustment again? Well, what I just highlighted again, the household dividend addresses the fairness issue for households. The border carbon adjustment addresses the fairness issue for industry. It's critical to avoid adverse industry impacts that could come from countries without a carbon fee. And so it removes any incentive for US industries to basically relocate to countries without that comparable price. And we can jump into discussing then what industries are likely to be at risk. And basically industries that are using a lot of energy and facing a lot of international competition. Those are the industries that are most likely to be at risk from trade competition. So let's design the adjustment around protecting those domestic industries. And there's a term that industries use within the trade nomenclature called energy intensive trade exposed, or EITE. There's a very wonky term for you. And basically they define that energy intensive as a firm that basically uses 5% more energy in their overall production costs. Very few firms do. And a competitive environment is basically if 15% or more of their product is exposed to trade internationally. And when you start kind of slicing and dicing those numbers, we're talking about less than 10% of all of the industries in this country that are actually going to be impacted on that front. And again, most industries' energy costs average about 2% of production costs. So a very small part of the overall footprint. And that would mean that for some of these other industries, though, a $25 or $15, whatever it is, carbon tax or carbon fee would increase costs by a lot more. So who then administers that fee? Well, existing institutions are already doing that with all of our other trade and tariff schedules. The Department of Commerce, the International Trade Administration, and the US Customs and Border Protection. All of those are already in sync and harmony doing this on different areas, not necessarily with the carbon border adjustment, but in other ways that they're monitoring our import and exports. And the funds collected, I think this is key to highlight, are separate from the carbon fee. The US imports more goods than it exports. So these funds, as this chart shows, actually build up over time. So that's another thing to our advantage. Now, legality-wise, is this actually going to hold up in international court? Well, there is a legal precedent. The US actually did something similar when we addressed all of the harmful chemicals, basically chipping away at our ozone layer with the Montreal Protocol. There was 197 countries that agreed to reduce ozone depletion substances, which are also greenhouse gases. And there's two different articles within the General Agreement on Trade and Tariff Principles, or the GATT, that the US follows that will allow for these adjustments. So let's talk about both of those. The most favored nation, Article 1, and a national treatment clause. And one of these, Article 20, from the GATT, is basically saying that it is discriminatory, it allows for practices for environmental reason for discriminatory practices. And basically what that means is that you can allow adjustments if they're necessary and you establish that they're protecting human, animal, or plant health, and or they relate to the conservation of exhaustible natural resources. And our trade lawyer team and the people that have looked at this policy cite both of these as examples for qualifying under the GATT considerations. So with all that being said, why global pricing? Well, any organization in the US that's climate focused is working towards climate policies domestically. But we know this, climate change is a global phenomenon. We're seeing it right now with the weird weather pouring in from the Arctic outside of our own borders. So the US policy must be one that addresses what's called the free rider problem, which basically means that people are always looking for free lunch, and if somebody else can pay the cost, they're going to take it. So let's think about how this policy addresses that concern. At this point, we want to make sure that anyone that is embedding costs, that society is bearing are fully present to paying those costs. And one way of achieving that is through basically a path to global carbon pricing. And this can start where a small number of countries negotiate the initial price that they're going to have to, not have a tariff or duty imposed when they're trading internationally. And especially as large economic powerhouses like the US or the EU or China come into that agreement, they can negotiate a multilateral agreement that really opens up this club for others to join. And I think it's also key to highlight that the Paris Agreement that we have now just recently re-entered with the Biden administration doesn't actually have enforcement. So that's why policies like this are key, because it may have ambition to get us to a 1.5 degrees Celsius world, but all of the reduction goals are voluntary. So right now, we're relying on each other's good faith without that economic or trade pressure to help us get there. And so here is a just brief summary of highlighting, again, the main structure for each of these areas, the three areas of the policy to consider. The fee works by slowly raising the price of fossil fuels, reducing demand and emissions. That steadily rising price allows all of us, consumers, industry, each sector, to respond with investment that's low carbon and innovate our way to better solutions. And there are benign or small nominal impacts at worst. If you factor in all the health benefits, we actually come out ahead. Revenue use. This dividend giving back to households is most equitable. It builds support from key constituencies and allows this policy to be ambitious. And if we use that revenue in other ways, we actually have a regressive unintended impact where lower income earning households actually come out more poorly than households that already are earning more. And the border carbon adjustment then is key also in addressing unfair foreign competition. It encourages other free riders to actually adopt the fee so they don't have to pay us for the privilege to trade with our country. And it incentivizes this global carbon pricing goal of having ambitious policies that also are enforceable. So with that, let's go back to the phones, and would love to hear what else people's questions are.
One of our participants asked, is there a possibility of the dividend ever coming full circle and no longer being required? For example, if the emission goals are attained, or if the majority of energy sources become renewable, will the dividend end or lessen?
That is such a great question. And yes, that's actually built into the policy because, as your listener highlights, at some point, obviously, if we're actually successful in reducing our use of these fuels, we basically will no longer need it at some point. And so there is basically a provision built in. Let me get to the actual terminology where the terms under the program would end. And I can put a link to this in the chat for you as well, so you can follow along with me. Basically, the fee enacted by this policy will stop rising, obviously, when we've achieved 90% reductions based on 2016 levels. And basically, if we hit a point where we're already at 90% reduction and the dividend to adults is less than $20 a month for 3 years, making sure that there's no hard landings for the end of the program, we'll be able to actually end the program. That's built into this policy. And the link in the chat just gives you that.
Wonderful. Lori, I think you have another question.
Well, I have my own personal question. So is there anything built into this that would promote, assist fossil fuel companies into diversifying into renewable energy?
So like a just transition element for the workforce?
Well, just to get them to diversify into, I mean, it's never made any sense to me why fossil fuel industries haven't already started moving more to wave energy or wind or solar, or they just keep pushing that fossil fuel. Is there any mechanism in there to help them make that transition?
Well, the mechanism itself is the strong price signal.
Okay.
So the policy itself doesn't get into just transition. I anticipate, this is just my own personal view, that when this policy goes through the committee markup process, there will be a lot of people proposing a lot of different ways to use the revenue outside of 100% dividend return to households, and whether some of that money goes to coal communities, oil and gas workers, you name it. This idea of just transition, helping provide retraining, reinvestment in those one town, one industry towns. I imagine that will be at the table proposed. But the reason why large oil and energy majors are actually signing on in support of similar policies is directly, as you've highlighted, Lori, because they have been asking for a price certainty for a long-term planning purpose. So if they know the predictability of a price, in 20 years is going to have this amount, they can do all sorts of mapping and planning with their own investment strategy to develop renewable energy and pour their money and put the chips where low carbon technology clearly are leading them.
Cool. Thanks so much for explaining it.
And if people are curious about some of those founding members, a link to a similar group called the Climate Leadership Council is in the chat, which includes several energy majors.
Here is another question, and it's kind of detailed, so I'm gonna I'll go a question at a time. What would be your recommendation to the government of developing nations which are just coming into their energy resources? I understand the best option would be to advocate for renewable energy, but also understand many countries are interested in taking advantage of their available fossil fuels, or where external actors are attempting to take advantage of the fossil fuels in foreign soil. So that's part A of the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no doubt that there is inherently a justice issue with, if you look at the way the U.S. has been able to, innovate and accelerate their own development heavily on fossil fuel development for the last 200 years, and now we go around the world and say, nope, you can't do that. You have to switch immediately to this new, transition, type era of energy development. The benefit of this policy is, I think, twofold for developing countries. And I'll actually go back to a slide that really kind of tries to speak to that briefly. And I know we're at time, so I probably won't have much time, but you can please feel free to reach out to me afterwards for any additional follow-up on this. And those two areas, and I'll just put my email here in the chat, are basically that it's allowing individual countries to decide still their energy mix. This policy isn't dictating how much energy should come from which country. But the other key thing with a dividend is that it allows for transparency. And so especially for developing countries, where we talk about this good fit here at the bottom, a good fit for developing countries, they're already facing so many challenges with corruption, with having to work through the resource curse. And so if you guarantee that that money goes back to household and not some general fund in the government program, where it's going to be obfuscated and people can't find it. It guarantees that people will support the popularity of this policy and that government can't corrupt it to invest in its own pet projects. So I think that's the other key area why this is a good fit for developing countries. And I do also just want to acknowledge again that, this is a global challenge that every country has their own right to determine how they respond to. So we're not trying to dictate the terms. This is a trade arrangement, but it is not saying or demanding that they have to follow a certain pathway. It's providing the economic incentives for them to participate, but it still leaves them, up to their own decision. So Georgiana, I'm just going to highlight one quick slide. I put a link at the beginning to our info session. You're more than welcome to join any Wednesday evening. But if people are curious, the two links I just put in the chat, one of which is to the monthly call-in campaign. If you just want to call Congress and be reminded with an email or a text a month to just voice your concern for climate action, sign up here with that link in the chat to our monthly call-in campaign program. It's separate from our general membership list, so people are welcome to sign up there and not even get emails from CCL. And the other thing is, for our Texas friends, this Saturday, we're actually going to have our regional online conference. And so the link in the chat goes to our program, including the keynote, our favorite climate communicator out of Texas Tech, Dr. Catherine Hayhoe. She's going to be keynoting it. So check that out in the chat. And with that, I'll stop sharing and pass it back to you.
Thank you, Brett, so much for joining us. And I can vouch for that regional conference. It is excellent. So if you have an opportunity, please try to join. So thank you, Dr. Brett Cease, for joining us today. As usual, you take a very complicated subject and make it very easily understandable. So we appreciate you, and we thank all of y'all for joining.